University, KHAS. But first, let me introduce my guests. Çiğdem Kafescioğlu is professor in the History Department at Boğaziçi University. She works on the visual, urban, and architectural culture of the early modern Ottoman world. She is the author of Constantinopolis/Istanbul, Cultural Encounter, Imperial Vision, and the Construction of the Ottoman Capital, and co-editor with Shirine Hamadeh of A Companion to Early Modern Istanbul, forthcoming in October 2021 from Brill. Shirine Hamadeh is Associate Professor in the Department of Archaeology and the History of Arts and Deputy Director of the Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations at Koç University. She is the author of The City's Pleasures, Istanbul in the 18th Century, and co-editor with Çiğdem Kafescioğlu of the Brill Companion Volume, Early Modern Istanbul, which will appear in October 2021. Cemal Kafadar is Vehbi Koç Professor of Turkish Studies in the History Department at Harvard University. Professor Kafadar is interested in social and cultural history of the Middle East and Southeastern Europe in the late medieval, early modern era. He teaches courses on Ottoman history, urban space, travel, popular culture, history, and cinema. His latest essays include How Dark is the History of the Night, How Black the Story of Coffee, How Bitter the Tale of Love, The Changing Measure of Leisure and Pleasure in Early Modern Istanbul. As I mentioned previously, tonight our focus will be on Reşat Ekrem Koçu and his Encyclopedia of Istanbul. As some of you may know, KHAS University has recently, few years ago, acquired the famous archive of the Encyclopedia and initiated a digitalization project together with Salt Research. At this very point, on behalf of KHAS University and my colleagues, I would like to express our gratitude to SALT Research Center and all our colleagues we have collaborated within the umbrella of Koçu Archive digitalization project. As I am aware that you would like to hear more from our guests, I will ask you to bear with me for a few moments and let me briefly give some information about Koçu, the Encyclopedia, and the archive. Reşat Ekrem Koçu was born in 1905 in Istanbul. He studied history at Darülfünun, the institution we know as Istanbul University today. Following his graduation in 1931, he became an assistant to Ahmet Refik Altınay at the university, another famous popular historian of the period. Koçu left his position in 1933 following Altınay's dismissal due to the new university reform. He became a history teacher first at Vefa, then at Pertemniyal High Schools. Parallel to his career as a teacher, he wrote numerous newspapers and liked the fictionalized accounts of a variety of subjects from Ottoman history. His works included a diverse group of subjects and styles, from scholarly works, new editions of historical texts such as Evliya Çelebi, to popular histories. Compiling an Encyclopedia of Istanbul was Koçu's own project. It was conducted by his personal endeavor with private sponsorship. The encyclopedia was realized thanks to the generous support from some businessmen named as Cemal Kafadar, who Koçu also dedicated his first 3 volumes. However, the lack of institutional background for the project resulted in a sudden drop twice. First, for the lack of enough financial support. The second is the death of Koçu himself in 1975. Koçu's first foray into compiling a city encyclopedia resulted in 3 large volumes published between 1944 and 1951. 7 years later, in 1958, he began publishing a second and more ambitious version of Istanbul Ansiklopedisi, which he claimed to be the world's first encyclopedia about a single city. According to the long list printed on the first page of each volume, which served as a kind of table of contents section, Istanbul Ansiklopedisi contained information about all architectural buildings in the city, from mosques and hammams to palaces and coffee houses, all famous men, from scholars and poets to dentists and gamblers who have lived there, its natural beauties, all calamities that have befallen it, from epidemics and earthquakes to fires and revolutions, the customs and traditions of its people in its all ages, its slang, its well-known visitors, books and poems written about it. After Koçu's death in 1975, the archive that made the encyclopedia possible became a secret. For a long while, scholars thought that it was scattered here and there and lost. However, around 2 decades ago, it was announced by the family of Enver Esenkova that the copyright of the archive was under their control. Finally, in 2018, the archive was acquired by KHAS University from Esenkova family as left by Koçu. Sorry, I forgot to pass through these pages, which I would like to show how encyclopedia was sold through, and people who has some of the intellectuals who has contributed to the encyclopedia. I'm sorry. Oops, I should stay here. Maybe I should wait for these images to be discussed our guests more. In 2018, the archive was acquired by KHAS University from Esenkova family as left by Koçu, organized in folders according to the volumes of the encyclopedia, a joint project between the university and SALT Research inaugurated. Before the accomplishment of digitization of both printed encyclopedia and his archival materials, we have started a series of public events as part of the project's first phase. To open up new horizons to study encyclopedia's possibilities, we have arranged an exhibition, public talks, workshops, and a graduate school course. Each event aimed different aspects of encyclopedia to contribute to social life in Istanbul. The second phase of the project, which were conducted with the collaboration of SALT and KHAS universities together, included the digitization phase. In this phase, more than 1,400 books of Reşat Ekrem Koçu's personal library are catalogued. The encyclopedia itself was the text of the encyclopedia was digitized, and the 11 volumes were retrieved through OCR reading. And the archive, which has included more than 40,000 documents, were scanned. What is it in the archive? The archive included all the documents in the archive have specific connections and patterns discovered through the digitization that reveal Reşat Ekrem Koçu's methodology, actually. The archive included, especially particularly the files, the folders in each for each letter, included article entry lists from the structure of the encyclopedia and the archive. For every letter, there are almost 10 to 25 article lists that helped us to visualize the final product that Reşat Ekrem Koçu has envisioned. Unpublished article entries or texts that have the same textual and visual structure of the published encyclopedia articles. Illustrations, notes, mostly in Ottoman Turkish and by multiple writers, press cuttings, photos, and postcards. So, maybe I should stop here after this brief introduction about Reşat Ekrem Koçu and the archive. And I'd like to turn to my guests once again. I'd like to thank you, first of all, again, Çiğdem Hocam, Shirine Hocam, and Cemal Hocam for your participation tonight and in our discussion about Reşat Ekrem Koçu. So I'd like to begin with a very general question, actually. I mean, you are all historians of the city. You are all you have a research on the history of Istanbul. So, how would you, as historians of this city, engage with Koçu? What is it that intrigues you in the Istanbul Ansiklopedisi or Koçu and his work? What would you say in that aspect? And maybe I'm not so sure who would like to start, but maybe I should give the first word to the ladies if Cemal Hocam will allow me. Maybe Çiğdem Hocam, would you like to start? You are muted, Hocam.
Actually, we had thought maybe Cemal could take up this question first, and
sorry, sure, follow. Why not?
Thank you for following the protocol.
Yes, there are so many things, but the core of it is, I guess, for me, thinking about this, I realized that my own adventures with Reşat Ekrem Koçu as a reader of his first, and then somebody as a historian, somebody who's engaged with his work, is now slightly more than half a century. I was acquiring some of his works when I was in junior high school. And Tarihimizde Garip Vakalar by the third edition at Varlık Yayınları was very close to my junior high school, Istanbul Ansiklopedisi, where I walked to purchase these perfectly affordable and portable little books. I really also have to just pay tribute to an age in which people like Reşat Ekrem Koçu were doing their best to perform some kind of public service for a reading public beyond a commercialized, beyond a heavily subsidized or otherwise institutionalized kind of publishing world. And Varlık Yayınları was also a very good example of that, where Gölpınarlı also published, another brilliant historian whose work never really made it into the academic circles in the way that they deserved maybe. But back to Reşat Ekrem Koçu, and you can see in the back, tarihimiz büyük kahramanlık ve yücelik olayları kadar meraklı, garip. Hatta bugün yadırgadığımız türlü olaylarla doludur. Suddenly, as a serious history reader at that time, it broadened my horizons into thinking that history could be much, much more than what we were studying as history, which was basically all we had access to at the time, either in school or the kinds of things that supplemented it. So, so many things, a kind of playfulness that was so very different from the histories of either the textbooks or the different ideologies that we were being subjected to. That kind of playfulness was something that struck me at the very beginning as another kind of history when I was not even thinking of becoming a historian, but another kind of history, at least as a history reader, I would continue to appreciate. And eventually, I also turned to that kind of playfulness, I hope, and I'd like to think in my history writing to the degree I could. I was also struck, like many of us were, by the kind of people who were included in his works, not just in the Istanbul Ansiklopedisi. My own adventures actually started with Tarihimizde Garip Vakalar, Patrona Halil, and Yeniçeriler. I also have to mention the question of access. It was not easy to have access to Istanbul Ansiklopedisi unless you had access to an institutional library. But those other little books were perfectly available and affordable in sahaflar, Beyaz Saray booksellers and places like that. And the question that it raised was, well, do these people have a place in history? Do these sorts of people have a place in history writing, in an encyclopedia to boot? My goodness. But he made it credible, creditable. He made it enjoyable. He made it a great learning experience. And beyond that, really horizon broadening kind of experience to have such folks in history writing and in encyclopedia. I was reading Semavi Eyice's entry in Diyanet Vakfı İslam Ansiklopedisi under Istanbul Ansiklopedisi. Of course, Semavi Bey having collaborated with Koçu for many years, and also somebody who was a friend and somebody who appreciated Koçu, still has some reservations, being a very different kind of historian and someone of a different temperament altogether. So he writes, ansiklopedinin yarım kalmasındaki başlıca sebeplerden biri, one of the most important reasons why the encyclopedia remained incomplete, tarihe geçecek derecede önemi olmayan kişilerin ve onların yazdıkları, manzumelerin, etc., sayfaları doldurmasıdır. This notion of tarihe geçecek önemi olan insan versus tarihe geçecek önemi olmayan insan. People who deserve to be in a history book and people who do not deserve to be in a history book, or people who deserve to be part of history. There, I guess you have to imagine history with a capital H, and those without. Later, I discovered that Carlo Levi was writing of a similar phenomenon when he was writing that Christ stopped at Eboli. When he went up the villages in the Italian countryside, he was sent there in exile, and he encountered folks, peasants, who he thought, he reflects throughout the book, have they ever really taken part in that thing that we call, educated people call history? It was that kind of an awakening and enlightenment for many of us to see different sorts of people have a different kind of place in a ultimately very moving oeuvre dedicated to a place, namely Istanbul. As a professional historian, eventually I put that together, reading things like the Subaltern School or Eric Wolf's People Without History even, which deals, of course, with a very different kind of matter and on a scale of nations and peoples marginalized by colonial regimes and colonial history writing. But still, it's a question that comes together around the larger issue of whose history, who are the people for whom and about whom and with whom we do write this thing that we call history. I think that is where Koçu mattered the most to me.
Thank you, Cemal Hocam. Actually, I would say hence is the title of maybe our event tonight, the writing on people and their place, maybe Istanbul, defining the Istanbul Ansiklopedisi in such a manner. Thank you for the answer. Maybe I should turn now from you to Çiğdem Hoca. Shall I? May I turn?
Of course.
To you.
I thought I signaled that way.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I had perhaps a somewhat similar, somewhat different experience. The Istanbul Ansiklopedisi was a kind of familiar presence at home. It was part of my late stepfather's library. I was aware of it. I would turn its pages and look and so on. But I think even when I read parts and look here and there for interesting parts and so on. But I think at first, as an undergraduate history student, I didn't quite know what to make of it. So I entered Koçu's work more through his first novels and then smaller works. Patrona Halil, for example, was an eye-opener because also suddenly I came to realize that this is a novel, historical novel, but there is such a rich layer of history there. There is such a rich body of knowledge, information, sources, chronicles, and what I gathered or what I sensed was material that he had access to. Another such experience was with Meyhaneler, again, not a fictional work, but again one of his smaller historical works. And again, this very, very tangible presence within these what Cemal has talked about, of these histories of people who inhabited these places. Also, this very very tangible sense of a connection to the material. And going into the encyclopedia with that sense, I think I had a new vision of it. I don't know. I can't locate this in time now, but again, a realization that there is an expansiveness here that kind of opens up not only into the material dimension, not only into the social dimension, but also into the practices, whether these were residual or continuous or recorded in one of the sources that he used. And maybe I could turn around Cemal's comment on people's place in history, and now someone working on architectural history, someone working on urban history, looking for processes, urban processes of space formation and use and so on. This was suddenly a heavily inhabited world. This is to anyone who is familiar to a more formal mode of history, architectural history writing. This is something very novel. To read about the Bedestan, for example, in Istanbul Ansiklopedisi, where you have first his account of how this building was first taken as a Byzantine building and how that idea was kind of argued against. Then Pakalın and a criticism of Pakalın on the terminologies. Then Ekrem Hakkı Ayverdi on the architecture, and then some newspaper pieces that talk about the use of the Bedestan vaults as storage spaces and as bank spaces up until the 1910s. So this was again something that connected the present use of the Bedestan to its historiography, to its architecture, and to what had remained of the very initial formulation, intention of this building. So maybe for now I'll leave it there. People in place and places with people. That is places inhabited, places lived in, places eroticized, socialized, battled, and so on and so forth by people.
Thank you, Çiğdem Hocam. This reminds me our discussion in architectural school, where we have discussed always these images of spaces without people, particularly in fancy architectural magazines. Koçu is quite a good example of how lived space is maybe explained or conveyed through textual sources to us, maybe. So I would like to turn to Shirine Hocam from here. Maybe you would like to also add your connection or your relation with Koçu and how you would like to discuss. Thank you.
Thanks, Melike. Yeah, I think of the three of us, well, not I think, I know that of the three of us, I have the shortest relation. I've had the shortest adventure in time with Reşat Ekrem Koçu and Istanbul Ansiklopedisi. And it began thanks to Cemal, actually. as I was beginning to dabble with history, with urban and architectural history in my PhD. So in many ways, I was very lucky to have encountered him very early on. My experience is in part very similar, or the nature of my engagement is in part very similar to those that Çiğdem and Cemal described. But also I think as a newcomer to the world of Istanbul, to Ottoman Istanbul particularly, but also to the whole discipline of history writing. I think the nature of my initial attraction was less so about what this Istanbul contained, partly because I was not very familiar with it, but with the way this city was presented. I mean, first of all, the whole idea of writing an encyclopedia about a city and, you know, mobilizing friends and friends of friends of friends and colleagues and whatnot. I mean, the whole idea seemed so crazy and quite fascinating, but there was something about the way the city's history was presented. You know, we talk, I mean, to use some of the cliches, we talk a lot about, you know, the vividness, the inhabitedness of places, and so on. But there was also something irresistible at the just the level of you know, pleasurable reading for me. And mind you, you know, I couldn't, you know, I read very slowly in Turkish, and, you know, I could not understand everything, but it's something that you know, made you want to read more. So maybe, you know, what I owe a lot to Koçu, to Istanbul Ansiklopedisi particularly here, I would say, is that it sharpened my awareness of what historical writing is. You know, what we write about, how we write about it, why, of course, do we write about it, and maybe it, you know, it provided you know, additional confirmation I needed that this could be fun, that this could be really a lot of fun. Now, there is, of course, the other aspect of my engagement, you know, in a more concrete way, perhaps as a student, as a PhD student, looking for material, looking for interesting material, looking for original material. Now, I don't have very clear recollections of, you know, how things happened, but one thing I'm very aware about is that is how the entries on Boğaziçi, the many entries, the dozens of pages, really had an impact on me. I mean, that I know for a fact. You know, a lot of poetry interspersed everywhere in every entry, and sub-entry, and then a sub-entry on Boğaziçi in Divan poetry, another sub-entry on the poetry on the Bosphorus, and so on and so forth. I mean, there were also these, I was looking at these again yesterday, and there were these sketches, I think by Sabiha Bozcalı, I'm not so sure, but based on these engravings that are now very famous by European travelers. And they're very rough sketches, but, you know, they're very fresh, conveying little fresh snapshots of places that, you know, I didn't know. So there was the Sahilname of Fenni in there. I mean, there was so much that really, yeah, I think there was something, maybe the way I should say it is that there were these associations that I didn't expect, that were surprising, and that really piqued my attention. A very simple word would be here, it was inspiring. in my more recent work also, I mean, there are, my interest in labor migrants, bekar, owes a lot to Koçu. I mean, not many talked about this layer of population that is so everywhere, but somehow remaining invisible. And there are other layers of the city's history or the city's people that made its history that until today we know hardly anything about, or not we know nothing about, but that we still find very few people having written anything about. Like I was thinking of Külhan Beyleri. There was this Buzia Tevfik, wrote about them, but then it was Koçu, and that's really where, if you are interested, this is where you would probably go and look for them. So yeah, I'll stop here. I think we'll be talking about many more aspects later in this conversation.
Sure, thank you. Actually, you have mentioned some of the, you have briefly mentioned some of my future questions as well, but I think it's a nice intro. It has been a nice introduction to like different layers of Koçu. Actually, you have mentioned of Koçu himself and his intellectual network on one side, his way of mobilizing his friends on one side, and then utilization of different sources and utilization of different, let's say, putting into different levels of different layers of the city into all this encyclopedia. As Cemal Hocam mentioned earlier, tarihi yazılmaya değer olmayan insanların da tarihinin hani yazıldığı way. So actually, I would like to continue from here to more Koçu as a historian himself. How would you like to, or would you like to go further into his personality, or I mean, maybe Çiğdem Hocam or Cemal Hocam, maybe you would like to go. Shirine Hocam a little bit mentioned about his history writing, but maybe Çiğdem Hocam or Cemal Hocam, you would like to focus more on his Koçu himself as a historian. How would you like to comment, for instance, his preferences? We have mentioned, Shirine Hocam just mentioned Külhan Beyleri, for instance, but who does he include and whom he doesn't include into this encyclopedia? I think is also an interesting question when we think about Koçu, for instance. Like what captures his focus? What kind of a city he sees in Istanbul? Cemal Hocam, Çiğdem Hocam, who would like?
Well,
I am hesitating, so please you go first. Cemal Hoca.
Kim başlıyor bilemek.
Why don't we change order this time?
Okay.
So why don't you take it?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Koçu as a historian, and what is most striking in his writing, maybe to start with the Istanbul Ansiklopedisi this time, but also keeping in view his other writings. The most immediately striking thing, perhaps, is the expansiveness of his work, his topics, his interests, and also a kind of a non-compromising determination, perhaps, to be inclusive, and connected to that. Maybe one of the striking things within that same frame is again his inclusion his inclusion of ordinary people, his inclusion, his interest in grand narratives and primary actors of Ottoman history, as much as his interest in what one might term the ordinary people, the small actors, the ones that we know little of or we have only glimpses of. And again, with that, maybe it's kind of a puzzle, perhaps, that all the turns that history has gone through starting from the later decades of the 20th century, the cultural turn, the literary turn, the spatial turn, now the sensual turn, the material, the environmental, and so on. With this, keeping this expansiveness in mind, we find all of that in Koçu. We find this very intimate connection to literature, and sometimes the indistinguishability of his writings, his literary writings and his historical writings, including his own and other, literary characters in the encyclopedia as, figures, Istanbulites that have a part, that have a place in the encyclopedia. So this very wide vision and openness to different material and to different viewpoints is, I think, a striking aspect. And I was thinking about this and wondering about this too. It is a fascination and also a bit of a puzzle. Should we really single out Koçu as, the one historian who has this expansive view and who has not turned away from the cultural, the literary, the popular, the spatial? Could we think of him together with someone like Köprülü, for example, a rather different profile of a historian? And maybe also I was looking at this İstanbul Üniversitesi tasfiyeleri to see if his name is in there with Ahmet Refik. He's not there, but I realized that Köprülü was the one who came in at the time that Ahmet Refik was expelled. But Köprülü's very groundedness in literature I was also thinking about. So whether it is the mid-centuries turning away from these multiple modes, multiple venues into historical writing is part of what makes his writing and his wider vision and these multiple perspectives more striking to us today. So I'll stop there and leave the ground to Cemal and Shirine.
Cemal Hocam, would you like to continue or?
Sure. And next time we start with Shirine.
Yeah, I think
or something like that.
Yeah, where Çiğdem Hoca just left the point where how do we evaluate Koçu within a larger genealogy of maybe Turkish or let's say historians of 20th century, or how do we? I mean, maybe we can also extend this question to how we can maybe think about his historiographical traditions of Istanbul as well. So where does he sit? How can we discuss about his his approach on Istanbul as well?
In my mind, this is partly connected to the earlier question of what kind of history did he do in terms of our reception, our own encounters with him, our own acquaintance with his work. What was the striking feature, whether he shared it with others or not? And here I remembered one of my early pieces when I wrote about the dream diary of Asiye Hatun, I think 1993 is when I wrote it. And in the beginning, I went over a few of the recent trends in history writing and then said, Reşat Ekrem Koç'un okurları açısından pek büyük bir yenilik yok yani. There is not much novelty, just as Çiğdem was saying. In all those turns, we recognized, readers of Koçu recognized something that we already had in him, though it wasn't coming from the same kind of methodological, conceptual, academic discourse. But there was something distinct in that kind of capaciousness to include different sorts of people, different sorts of places, and different sorts of interests, such as people's dreams, such as people's odd ways of doing this or that or the other, people's fears, the impact of smell on city life. These were hardly thinkable in the kind of history writing that we did encounter with regard to Ottoman history or Istanbul history. So also I concluded in this piece with the comment that by publishing this source, benzeri kaynakların aranması ve değerlendirilmesi ümidiyle yayımlayarak şimdiye kadarki siyaset, kurum, iktisat ve erkek ağırlıklı gelişme çizgisini aşmaya doğru yönelen Osmanlı tarihçiliğinin merak ufuklarının genişlemesine küçücük bir katkıda bulunabiliriz belki. In this, of Turkish historians, of that historiography, where I have many, of course, figures I admire and keep learning from, Köprülü among others, and not just for the early Ottoman state or early Sufism in Anatolia, but also for his unfortunately underappreciated work on aşık poetry in city life, in coffee houses and places of that sort. In that sense, there was an overlap with the interests of someone like Koçu. In any case, siyaset, kurum, iktisat ve erkek ağırlıklı. If you think about these as, if I'm at least to some degree correct, accurate in identifying these as persistent emphases of the way Ottoman history has been written, then Köprülü was indeed the exception, if not the only exception, but somebody who opened us different venues. So it's a tribute to Koçu more than anything else, that historiographic assessment I was trying to make while publishing that unusual source from the mid-17th century. He did, in my mind, he's closer to a kind of history writing in the framework of 20th century history writing in Turkey in particular, on the Ottomans or on Istanbul as such. He's closer to figures who did not find themselves a happy home in academia. Let me put it that way. Namely, Ahmet Refik Altınay or Abdülbaki Gölpınarlı, whom I should mention again. They were always read. In varying degrees, they were appreciated for the sources they utilized, some of them popularizers more than others, but overall, they too never really made themselves a happy home within academia. He belongs more in that category than anything else. And, this eroticization that Çiğdem touched upon, or recognizing the erotic in history in general, in the life of Istanbul in particular, did not go well with this historiography either, with a kind of academic historiography that's been dominant. It was even more so, of course, at that time. So for instance, even in a recent newspaper item, I have read about a very new publication, a very welcome publication of an encyclopedic nature on Istanbul. Again, stuff of myths, Revnakoğlu, the stuff of myths. Was it lost? Where is it? Who is it? And now it's finally edited. Wonderful work, etc. But in the newspaper item I was reading about this, unfortunately, it was juxtaposed to Koçu with the comment that Koçu's encyclopedia reads like scenes from Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's totally unfair and beyond, but we all know where it's coming from. We all know it comes from the idea that Koçu was open to at least giving you a feeling of the kind of erotic experiences that the city offered, and not just of the heterosexual nature or the heteronormative nature. So in all this, Koçu was, whether he really intended it or not, quite different and difficult to accept within the historiography, though there are more overlaps that I could also mention, but the one with Köprülü I did, of that interest in coffee house poetry, for instance. Just one footnote about the way our approach changes during my lifetime. The Patrona book I read, the Patrona novel I read, had the subtitle, Devlet gücünü zedelemiş bir serserinin romanlaştırılmış hayatı. That's a brilliant subtitle. And that intrigues you if you are interested in the history of political uprisings, political contestation, so on and so forth. And romanlaştırılmış hayatı also gives you a sense that it's a biography based on something, but it's turned into a novel. It's fictionalized partly, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the recent editions omit or delete the subtitle. I wonder if it's the changing taste of the public, or if it's simply an assumption or a presumption on the part of the publishers. I'd like to think it's the latter, that it's more of a publisher's choice, and one I do not agree with. Just wanted to add that as a footnote, because we keep mentioning the book Patrona Halil, and his other works have similar approaches, either through subtitles or through combining research, source research with some fictionalization, which is an avowed part of the writing. Koçu is not playing you both ways. So if it's fictionalized, it tells you it's romanlaştırılmış hayatı. And that's why the encyclopedia, I think, is not that difficult to negotiate in terms of, when we talked with Shirine about this many times, in terms of looking for the factual versus whatever.
Thank you. Shall I?
Yeah, please.
Actually, what you have mentioned about Koçu and his how he engaged with the city, and actually his writing about his history writing and his relation with also fiction writing. Actually, I would like to move to that direction as well. But before that, I would like to ask Shirine Hocam, would you like to add anything about this identity of Koçu as a historian, or his relationship with the city, or his engagement with urban history of Istanbul? I mean, would you like to comment on that? Or maybe I can also, I can ask my question maybe after your answer.
Okay. Yeah, I want to come back to something that, a word that Cemal used earlier, which is public service. And I thought it was very appropriate, because there is, for me, there is this very strong sense of a passion, clearly, by a historian for the city, but also a tremendous sense of generosity, of this need to, not need, this wanting to share, wanting to give access. And this is how, you know, I see this, what some call this inability to stop, like where do you stop? What do you exclude from this encyclopedia? And it seems that, you know, as long as documentation is possible, and he will do everything for it to be possible, this place will have a place and a few lines at least to be said about it. There are a couple of examples. There's one here in my notes. There's a tiny little fountain from the beginning of the 17th century of a Jutish. He says, it's in ruin. There's a ruined wooden house on it. It doesn't work. There's no water. The tap is broken. In short, it's a nothing. But then he finds this one verse chronogram, and he says it's in beautiful Jeli script. And then he takes the time to copy it, to describe it, and so on. So, in another place, in a small wooden church from the early 19th century, Ayos Yorgos in Bakırköy, he says there's nothing significant about this place, really. He says, literally, like from an artistic viewpoint, he says, yapı sanatı bakımından hususiyet ve kıymeti yoktur. But he still has almost a full page of documentation, including, one of his and his group, many visits, many, first-hand documentation on a place when enough documentation was not available. And so, he tours this church, and he ends up with this tour of the many, many icons in this Greek church, and a list of the donors. And this becomes, in turn, an extremely interesting thing, that one questions about the patronage of churches patrons were multi-confessional. There were Armenians patronizing this Greek church. And see, it's this, question that brings question, that brings question, that brings question, that is absolutely delightful, really, in the way these entries are put together. And one last thing I will just emphasize, because, we talked about, and I totally agree with this, of course, this idea of people who have a place, who have a right to the history of the city, who shaped it in, whatever way. But he has a very similar approach to place as well. So places, buildings, not monuments, buildings, small, big, ruined, in great shape, restored, badly restored, he will always have something to everything. It's again, like Çiğdem was saying, this inclusiveness that is absolutely remarkable. And it makes for, obviously, a very richly layered city, both modern, of his time, and historical. So, yeah, there's a lot more to say on this, but, we can spend another few hours.
May I come in on this, just to add to
sure,
the
please.
notion of places, where he even goes way beyond the architectural, as we have talked about amongst ourselves, Çiğdem, Shirine, and I. Let me just, and I brought this volume with magnificent, moving list of ayazmas in the city, holy springs. Not all of them connected to something architectural beyond a neighboring building or something. These are holy springs where the water itself is the only thing that mattered in some instances, like the Balıklı Ayazması, for 2 millennia now. Many others have been lost in the meantime, but Koçu gives space, place, to more than 100 ayazmas, holy springs, in this instance, specific entries, each one with its own entry, with something like this. Fındıklı'da, Salı Pazarı'nda, Meclis-i Mebusan Caddesi'nde, köşededir. Madame Atina Nikolaidi'nin sahibi bulunduğu binada Bayan Zeliha Doğru Söz'ün işlettiği aşçı dükkanının altındadır. So the reference to an architecture is only to find the address, but the actual entry is about a holy spring, about a spring that people considered holy. And there are nearly 150 of these, each one visited by somebody working with Koçu, a young bureaucrat, each one visited with a brief report about them. So his inclusiveness is amazing in so many ways. And it's not just about different kinds of people that we did not really go over yet. But since your question partly included it, let me just mention my own list very quickly. The kind of people who would otherwise not be considered worthy of history, as we keep saying, people who perhaps belong in an earlier era to the Şehrengiz literature with their names and certain attributes, but also great men, whatever great man is considered to be in history writing, some pasha, some famous vizier, something. Some very, very unusual women whose characters we know nothing about, or whose presence even, such as Benli Behiye in 1826. I won't go over the story, but I recommend everyone to go and read the entry on Behiye. She's just terrific. And the Ménage à Trois, of which she was a part, now talking about eroticization. Here he writes about a ménage à trois between Benli Behiye, her beloved Janissary, who was in the barracks in 1826 and killed there, and the male lover of that Janissary in that ménage à trois that he found in a mejmua. And ultimately also he has lots of foreigners in his encyclopedia, which is unusual. You know, the hippie visitors to the city, or in the Giyim Kuşam Sözlüğü, which is another encyclopedia of his. So let's not forget about his inclusion of new things, new persons, new types of characters, be they foreigners or locals or whatnot. I said enough, but I thought it caps this particular discussion.
But I think, as when Koçu and Ansiklopedya is considered, we can discuss about his content. Hours and hours, maybe. I never feel like I would like to hear more about actually. But maybe if you like, we can move from here to, as you briefly mentioned before, Cemal Hocam, about his history writing and about his storytelling, and of course his poetry that you have outlined previously. Maybe would you like to comment on that as well, or shall I turn to maybe Çiğdem Hocam to more focus on his way of history writing and his maybe storyteller Koçu as a storyteller, maybe? Would you like to?
Maybe I'll go into something slightly different, and then that might be a connection to the poetry as well. Cemal just mentioned Benli Behiye and this ménage à trois and Koçu's mode of eroticizing history and eroticizing also places. Something, and this is, we all know that this is part of the reason that, Koçu is, unreliable, not the, serious historian and so on. One thing to be perhaps brought in, and maybe in some ways connected to what I was saying earlier, his connectedness also modes of urban knowledge and modes of urban writing, pre-modern forms of urban writing. Şehrengiz was mentioned, the genre of poetry that is focused on beautiful young male of the marketplace, and this is in a way one of the things that comes up very very often, in relation to Koçu, and also, he also uses, Şehrengiz-like Aşık literature and so on. But maybe there is a mode of writing there that is on the urban professional artisanal classes that is in a way presented through the mediation of the beautiful young male urbanites, professionals, where the social belonging of these individuals, their material environment, their material connections, the objects that they work with, what they wear, and so on, and their erotic persona and the erotic charge they bring onto places cannot be really pulled apart from each other. This is the case if you look at Şehrengiz, but also it's the case when you look at the Mecmuai Letaif or the Esnaf Letaifleri and so on. There is, or for example, if you look at the Intizami Surname, a similar bringing together of these aspects that perhaps modern historiography has kind of tried to pull apart and problematize the homoerotic content and do away with it or close one's eyes to it, and then we have a certain understanding of the Şehrengiz. Then we read the Letaif Esnaf only for the information on Esnaf that they produce, and so on. So one of the I think interesting things, both in his writing but also in the encyclopedia, the way the encyclopedia is structured, is this type of connection as well, or perhaps it's a refusal to break away from this, extant mode of urban writing and extant mode of urban knowledge. So I don't know if that is something to continue from, Cemal, but for now I'll leave it there.
Definitely, yes. We could go for hours, but let me just say, unmute. Okay. Yes, I think the Mecmua tradition is really deep in his arsenal or in his working materials, obviously, and the Letaif type of thing, various other kinds of. His approach is somewhat of a, not fully, but somewhat of a Mecmua compiler. Like his approach is capacious, simply to the material, to the different kinds of knowledge that you referred to. His approach is expansive, as you keep pointing out, you and Shirine, also the generosity there. The 17th century Mecmuas in particular, I think, developed that character much more fully than ever before, when Mecmuas were compiled materials on a coherent set of topics, if not merely one topic, like geometry, like cosmology, like amulets. The 17th century Mecmuas developed this kind of approach where you have agglutinative is another word that comes to mind, an agglutinative approach to different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of people, different kinds of places which they want to include in the Mecmua, and the kinds of authors who write. Many of them are people who identify themselves or who are known as Çelebis, which is another connection, I think, of the temperament that Koçu can be connected with to the early modern Istanbulite ways of writing, ways of knowing, ways of sharing information. So there are those aspects of this. And also another aspect of the 17th century that I think we see continued in Koçu. He may be the last representative, though I don't like to finalize any such thing, the last Mohican kind of a thing. But in any case, the urban tale becomes the tales that happened among relatively ordinary people in a city, which people have heard about. So based on an account of some love affair or some murder or both, those kinds of things, turns into a subject, a popular subject for literature. And the same is true in different parts of the world in the 17th century. I always associate Saikaku Ihara with Eremya Çelebi in Istanbul. And they were the first almost to write these kinds of novels about the love affair between, in Eremya's case, between a Jewish girl and an Albanian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox boy, which led to a great conflict between the Greek Orthodox and the Jewish communities of Istanbul. Indeed, it did. There was an affair. She agreed to convert in the end to Christianity, and the two fled to Wallachia. And thereafter, the two communities were experiencing several altercations and whatnot. And Eremya Çelebi sat down and wrote a fictional story about it, slightly fictionalizing it, wrote a story about this in Turkish, in Armenian characters, hoping it would be popular. And that kind of approach to the urban tale is I think, something primarily of the early modern era, especially of the 17th and 18th centuries. And Koçu has a good feel for it and does know what to make of it in a more 20th century vein in writing his works. It seems
Shall I turn to Shirine Hocam? Would you like to comment on that as well about Koçu and his? Actually, you have mentioned a little bit about how he writes on history. So maybe we can turn, if you like, we can turn to my final question from here, where I would like to ask more about. I mean, we have spoken about his way of dealing with history, but we can also discuss, maybe he's an archivist of the city, right? We also, while speaking about the content, both Çiğdem Hoca and Cemal Hoca also mentioned, and you also mentioned, actually, he's in a way, in his way, archiving the city. But this is a valid feature not only for the history of the city, but also maybe for his day, for his present of the city as well. Like for the 20th century, because we know that his period when he was compiling was a period of transformation, rapid transformation for Istanbul. And we always speak about transformation in Istanbul in different times. From, I mean, it's not only 19th century, not only 20th century. Istanbul is constantly changing. But Koçu's way of transcribing these transformations, maybe shall we more go into that direction, if you like? How does he write down, or how does he respond to this transformation, and how does he bring together with all these aspects that you have mentioned about the history and his utilization of different people? I mean, all these layers, how do they come together and how we can look from here to the 20th century of Istanbul, maybe, or the sense of Reşat Ekrem Koçu, how does he respond to the city? Shirine Hocam, would you like to go first, or shall I turn?
Yeah, I actually, I'm just jotting down a note here. Before going into this, I wanted to Actually, I would like to say something about 2 points that came up, or maybe I'll just speak about one. I mean, going back a little bit to this idea of storytelling and the urban tale and what is history and fiction. And again, this is, to go back to something that Çiğdem said earlier about, the many turns that our recent generations of historians have lived through and gone through. This was also, I think, one important turn that many of us, at least, were profoundly affected by, which maybe can be summarized with the title of one book, Fiction in the Archives, by Natalie Zeman-Davis. And what is the thin line sometimes between this, there is a storytelling mode of writing in Koçu. It's very true. And some of his friends and collaborators to the encyclopedia. But there is also this sense of history as a story, which it is in many ways. And this is something I think that it needs to be, taken a little bit more seriously or with more respect. I say this because I know that this is, one of the big questions that have, or maybe criticism that have been leveled, or the questions surrounding the credibility of Koçu has also something to do with this. And, I was telling Cemal and Çiğdem some time ago that, when I first started reading the encyclopedia and I was writing my dissertation, I didn't know what to do with him. Can this be a footnote? Is it a good enough footnote? Is it a academically reliable, acceptable footnotes? And there is, I think, a lot that we need to think. We need to do a lot more thinking about this connection between history and story, or history and fiction, if we want to call it so, and to just turn things around. We also need to point out that there is a lot of seeking precision in Koçu. There is, his engagement with earlier historians does not stop at, paraphrasing them or quoting them directly. He corrects also. He takes the time to correct or lament at somebody, even at, he is actively partaking of this, historiography. There is again, I'm going to say another verse, a poetic verse, where he uses, he's talking about a mosque, and I can't recall which, but he uses a chronogram that was already included in a listing by Tahsin Öz, and he quotes them in full, and then he says, but the dating is wrong, and he counts again the letters, and he takes a whole paragraph to argue his point, and then he continues the description. So there is, this need for precision is not to be taken lightly as well. This is, a footnote to the point about history and fiction. To go back to your later question, the question about, what happens when the city changes, and there's something. One of the most striking, perhaps, things about the encyclopedia is that it's as if a work in construction that will never end. As long as the city changes, as long as there will be more people populating it, this encyclopedia has to continue. It just cannot stop. So it's not because it stopped for, these unfortunate and pragmatic reasons, including death. It's also because there is a very strong sensitivity towards change. It's something, there is, on one hand, a sense of loss that happens in the 1950s, and I think Cemal and Çiğdem can talk about this better than I can, but there is a clear sense of loss, but it's not this, nostalgia about things gone. It's as if, it's like he's dispossessed of something to which he had the right to, in a, I think, a very similar way in which most of us feel nowadays, not in Istanbul only, but around the world. There is a sense of something there, habits of life that you have taken or something you have looked at and with a lot of joy, things that gave you, that moved you in any which way in the city, and they are no longer there. There is that, but there is also an amazing curiosity about, everything new and everything coming into the city. Like, Cemal was saying, I was looking at this, entry on the Fransa Transatlantique, the French transatlantic that, docked for 2 days, 2 whole days in the port. But, it's worth an entry because it's such a curiosity. It's one of the most luxurious transatlantics and so on and so forth. So I think Cemal and Çiğdem will have more to say on this, but there is definitely a curiosity towards the change, the new, there are lots of terms, lots of people, terms also, terminologies that come into the encyclopedia as if, now part of the cultural and social world of Reşat Ekrem Koçu and his and all Istanbulus. So, and there is at the same time the big destructions that were happening, particularly under Menderes, and the enormous modernization that went in all these different directions. Maybe I'll give the floor to my friends here on this.
Çiğdem Hocam, would you like to continue?
Sure. Can I first put in a parenthesis? We kind of go back
Sure.
in jumps. This issue of the Mecmua. I just wanted to note that there is, I agree, there is a very strong connection to the Mecmua, that the Mecmua, as we know, that, came to its own in the 17th century, the personal collection or compilation of different genres, but also a connection to the modern Mecmua. A connection to the Mecmua as it was part of the print worlds of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, also through his mentors, Ahmet Refik, Ahmet Rasim, and their participation in this through these fragmentary forms like the Şehir Mektupları of Ahmet Rasim, and so on. And I just wanted to talking about novelty too. There is in his entry on Ahmet Refik, there is this little quote on him as a boy of 10 or 11 years, not knowing exactly what author he is reading. This turns out to be Ahmet Refik, and later he finds out that Refik is actually his future mentor. He says, this is about Yeni Mecmua and Ahmet Refik's pieces in the Yeni Mecmua. O yazıların yeni, taze, canlı şeyler olduğunu hissetmiştik. So we had sensed that there was something new and fresh and vibrant in this new kind of readings. And I was just wondering if, could he be the first generation of authors to really be, come into the literary world through this encounter with these new types of mecmuas, these periodicals that are, available in a different manner. So that's my rather long parenthesis. So the other I will cut short. The one thing I think, Shirine put it very well. The present is very much there, and with all this, again, inclusiveness and curiosity of Koçu, it's there regarding, again, the minute, the minor, and the grand, including the açık hava müzesi, and also blue jean pantolonlar worn by working class people, etc. This issue of loss, I would just maybe like to say something on that very briefly. Again, we are maybe used to interpretations of Koçu as an antiquarian, as someone who collects, as someone who, amassed all this material to put in his novels and, made the encyclopedia again out of what he had, collected of the past, past layers of the city. And I would like to perhaps...
Çiğdem, your voice is gone.
Pardon. Şimdi geliyor mu? Geliyor. Kendi kendimi yaptım, tıkadım herhalde. So I think what is there? Of course, yes, a sense of loss, a sense of frustration and anger, certainly. And he picks up from Yahya Kemal his analogy of kör kazma, the blind pickaxe, and this becomes the kör kazma of Menderes in the several campaigns towards urban renovation, which to him are brutal acts of destruction mostly, but the human layer is also always there. The human fabric that is destroyed or that is harmed by these interventions is part of his reaction. And one of the places in the encyclopedia that this becomes very visible is his entries in Balıkpazarı, which was one of the places that was subject to this kind of opening up the square and pulling down of destruction of many of the streets where many of these taverns that are the subjects of his entries and places in his novels and articles. Basically, not only the physical fabric, but the human fabric there is destroyed, and this is also his reaction. And I think this is again this would be very different to my mind, at least, from a more I don't know how to term it, a kind of a sense of antiquarianism, a desire to preserve what remains of the vestiges of the past for the sake of preserving them. So again, perhaps it's the living city with all its layers, very multiple layers, is there also in his reaction to the interventions that he witnessed. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Çiğdem Hocam. Cemal Hocam, would you like to take from here? Maybe?
Yes, I want to confirm the significance my brilliant colleagues have placed on this sense of loss without a sense of nostalgia. I think both Çiğdem and Shirine just put it so well in different words, but if you think about Svetlana Boym, my late colleague, the future of nostalgia starts with the coining of the term nostalgia from Greek nostos in the 17th century. Again, the world of mejmuas and urban tales. And it's about, it was then characterized as a pathology, similar to actually being struck by say, witch mania, and it is a pathology that arises when you lose your way back home, when you are unable to return to whatever it is that you call home, or sıla would be, I think, a comparable term, also important in pre-modern Galenic medicine regarding human nature and ailments and whatnot. Obviously, we don't use it in that kind of pathological sense, not much of the time anyway, in our own day and age, but there is clearly, again, that feeling that nostalgia is characterized by that feeling of loss of sıla, or an opportunity to return to one's sıla, home. It just isn't the case that Koçu is looking for or is bemoaning the loss of, he's bemoaning losses, he's observing losses, but he's not bemoaning the loss of an idealized back home someplace, kind of an idea of a past. I compare it, for instance, to Ibrahim Hakkı Konyalı's reactions to the great transformations of the city in the 1950s. Konyalı is very close to that kind of sense of nostalgia. Places are lost forever. It's a kind of past when he makes account of the places in that eventually became parts of Vatan Caddesi and Millet Caddesi. He doesn't have any appreciation for any of the taze that may have arisen in the same 1950s. And that word that came out in the citation Çiğdem read to us, again connects us to the world of the early modern mejmuas and whatnot. There is an appreciation of taze, the freshly voiced, the freshly articulated, the freshly produced, freshly made for us to enjoy in an improved new life form. That other side of Koçu is, I think, what keeps his work from being antiquarian or nostalgic, narrowly understood.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Cemal Hocam. Actually, this was kind of outlined maybe we started from Koçu and his people and his places. Now we kind of wrapped up how actually he approached to these spaces and places together. Actually, I would like to, I kind of came to an end of my questions, but I'm sure there might be among our colleagues in Zoom or maybe from YouTube, we can have some questions. But before that, I have a personal question, actually. I have a personal interest in Koçu, which is more actually related with Koçu and the intellectual network that surrounds him, because that the people who, you have briefly mentioned the intellectuals that he, or friends, or his kind of colleagues that he has mobilized. So I have a curiosity about these people. How we know that, of course, he knows some of them and he invites some of them. But what about their? How would you comment on that hub of intellectuals? Because I think like his office in Cağaloğlu might be considered something like an intellectual hub, can't we? I mean, because we know that he's inviting scholars there and he's discussing these issues. So what kind of an impact does he have around his network, around his maybe integration with the larger intellectual environment of Istanbul, maybe in that period? Would you like to comment on that as well?
Maybe very quickly, I mean, from the encyclopedia, from what's written on the encyclopedia by Semavi Ece, by Erdem Yücel, who were both participants in the project, we do get a sense of this Cağaloğlu office as a sort of a hub to which he, invited either younger scholars or scholars who were already experts in their fields and were writing. But maybe Cemal or Shirine have more to say on this. It would be, I'm trying to remember if Emre Ayvaz, who has this very good master's thesis on Koçu and the encyclopedia particularly, trying to remember if he had a discussion of this, but I would have to look. That would be in your mode of discerning networks, Melike. That would be a good project. And through time, of course, that would be a dimension of this. We're talking about this, stretch of several decades, the intermission, the starting again, the view that he got more and more on his own through the later volumes and so on. I don't think the content or the approach changed really, but it would also be interesting to just follow the volumes in this manner.
Thank you. I'd like to say that my friends in Zoom, maybe you can write on, if you'd like to ask questions, you can write on chat, or if you'd like to just ask a question, just open your camera and microphone and I can give the word to you. I'm checking also from YouTube, but I think people are...
Should someone say a word on exclusion, since we talked so much about inclusion?
Would you like to say? Sure.
I picked up your network question, so...
No, but...
So, yeah, actually, I can,
I'll bring it back to Çiğdem, but I just want to say, even with your network question, I don't have much to say, but one thing that I would have added is how few there are of the Greeks and Armenians of the city that could have been included. It's not necessarily a willful policy of excluding them or any such thing, but the world of the late 40s, 50s, 60s of that era probably led to many of the communities to go on their own much of the time. It's impressionistic, but I can also to add, by the way, to people who were not included in academic world, in addition to Reşat Ekrem Koçu and Gölpınarlı and others, Kevork Pamukçıyan, Hrant Andreasyan could easily have been in another time, in another kind of political formation. They could easily have been professors of Istanbul University or some such place with all the work they have done. It's just hard to figure out for me whatever there is for at that time hanging out together or not, the way things happened beyond Koçu's preferences or not. And that is returning issue of exclusions to Çiğdem, where I believe she has more to say than just the matter of contributors.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Again, this would revolve basically around non-Muslim, non-Turkish communities, whether of the present or the past of Istanbul. And here, I think there is maybe more to just what was around him. These are interesting, actually, contributions. You know, AEJ is there until I don't know which volume to write all the pieces on Byzantine structures. Pamukjian is there to write on everything, historical and contemporary, on Armenian sites and people and persons and so on. But there is also, at least if I'm reading it correctly, there is maybe a combination, and maybe that's not very special to Koçu either, a sense of this, you know, the Ottoman hierarchization of communities, whereby the Muslim community, not only the authority, has the upper hand, but also, you know, to reinforce that, a sense of Türk Istanbul. And Türk Istanbul is something that we come across as frequently as, you know, büyük şehrin tarihi kütüğü, büyük şehrin günlük hayatı, and so on. This does not mean that it excludes these individuals, many of his tavern keepers and bath attendants and so on, you know, pulled out from poems and tezkires and so on, are Greek or Armenian or Jewish individuals. But there is in the writing that there is, you know, this sense of Türk Istanbul, which becomes, I think, more visible in the entries when there is any reference to a, you know, intercommunal conflictual situation. I won't take more time to give examples now, but maybe this is also, since we made I think we rightly underlined the capaciousness, the inclusiveness of the encyclopedia, we should also perhaps step back from creating a kind of a romanticized image of it as a, you know, as an inclusiveness that had certain, you know, gaps, that had certain omissions, and obviously major omissions. And one last bit. This we were talking with Shirine and Cemal. I was struck by the presence of an entry on Ağustos, where the entry has a description of the Panayır, the 15th of August celebrations for Mary, and then no Eylül entry. You know, an Eylül entry could have several things, of course, but it would also have a, you know, reference to 6-7 Eylül, the 6th and 7th September pogroms, which are nowhere else in the encyclopedia either. So yeah, you know, with the capaciousness also important absences, let's say.
Thank you. We have a few questions from the audience here. There is Gürbey Hiz who raises hand, and there is, I think this is Ufuk, with a number. She is asking a question. Gürbey, if you allow me, I'll start with Ufuk's question first, and then I'll give the floor to you. So she has written that she has a question to Cemal Hoca. Why do you think that he includes ayazmas into the encyclopedia? I mean, in which context they are relevant to Istanbul as religious spaces or spaces of healing? And the broader question, if we consider Foucault's order of things, for instance, as a classificatory system, how Koçu breaks down the city into encyclopedia entries, she said. She said Cemal Hoca, but I think that can be also, I mean, if Çiğdem Hoca and Shirine Hoca would like to respond, of course, we would like to hear that as well. Cemal Hocam, buyurun.
Yes. The ayazmas he includes primarily as healing places, healing traditions. And he bemoans the fact that Istanbulites of his day are not so familiar with them anymore, that many of them are on the verge of being forgotten. That is why they go to this great effort to locate whatever they hear about and identify. He does mention the fact that it comes from the Greek tradition, but overall he sees it as part of Istanbul's healing spaces, healing traditions, manners of dealing with ailments of all sorts. It's though he does obviously also record the fact that many of them are inside or next to Greek Orthodox churches. There is that kind of also a physical, intimate connection with Greek Orthodox religious buildings. But as healing traditions, he writes of them as things beyond uses of one particular community. The Foucault question is a much bigger one. Why did you think of Foucault in asking about the order of things in an encyclopedia and not Borges, for instance, which would be the first to come to my mind? Foucault is more theoretical, clearly, yes, but so maybe if you say a few more words about the question itself, otherwise it's just too big. It's a classificatory system, yes, but I mean, the issue, yeah, I'll just have to really just wait for you to say, yeah.
Yeah, just trying to, sorry, I cut your, but I was just trying to think of, logic of his, what is a broader logic? Is there a broader logic, or is it just like the people, places, and I don't know. So how does he kind of classifies things? That's yeah.
So it's also beyond Foucault. Yeah, at the more ground level, before anything else. How does he classify things? What gives order to it all?
Yeah.
Anyone like to take that? I mean, other than I have to think about this a little bit, having emphasized capaciousness, inclusiveness, expansiveness, now the coherence of it all, other than
very shortly, part of it is place-based and part of it is source-based, maybe. So I can say something on the source-based aspect. Maybe Shirine can pick up on the rest. He has a method of chopping up chronicles, biographical dictionaries, Şehrengiz poetry, other poetry, to their kind of elements, personal elements, object elements, place elements, and then each one of these has a right to an entry, has a place in the city. So each, beautiful young man in in the Taşlıcalı Şehrengiz. Every individual that Evliya mentions in the Seyahatname, every medrese or mosque or hankah or bath, etc. in the Hadikatül Cevami, and so on and so forth. Events, vaka, in the chronicles. So I think this is part of the method, and this is part of this, what we have been talking about as capaciousness, and this is also maybe in part kind of informs the shape, the structure of the encyclopedia. So I stop there. And yeah, maybe Shirine could.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question because it's very, very broad, but there could be many things to say. I mean, one, what Çiğdem was saying now, this extracting, everybody and everything, every place, also material culture that appears in historical texts deserves an entry, is part of history, is part of the logic. I mean, we go back to this, tremendous inclusiveness that all these places, objects, people have in their own way shaped the history of the city. They became a part of the history of the city. So that's one part of it. There is another thing that comes into, I was going to say something about the alphabetical order also that brings in its own, system of coherence, like imposes its own coherence. And, that Emre Ayvaz has written very nicely about. I mean, there's, we all tend to think of, I think, or I did at least, I'll speak for myself, of encyclopedias as necessarily alphabetical, but in fact, it's when Diderot wrote his encyclopedia, it was just a decision he made, and that decision, the alphabetical order that subverts all sorts of orders that we might have in mind as historians, as observers, as a partaker of life in a particular place, brings its own interesting logic, if you want. And that's what brings a sultan and a small, fishmonger, to cohabit the same page. And this visual cohabitation of the page is also, something that I was thinking about earlier. It's something that is very interesting, very, very worth, pondering when you have these completely different people inhabiting at different times a city and coming together on a visual space like this. There is, another logics also have changed perhaps in the way that, the earlier volumes and the later volumes have been structured. I think, we will be going in too many different directions on this. It's a very broad question. So perhaps we can pick it up later.
It's a really good one that maybe we should separately at some point, I don't mean at this meeting, really consider the alphabetical order doing some work there, but it really, and exactly along the lines, exactly along the lines that Shirine suggested, I think. Let's just call it egalitarian for lack of brevity, for the sake of brevity. But beyond that, what is the logic of what is there? And that we put together in different words. But capaciousness itself is not a logic, really. And Shirine also went a good way by speaking about the method of amputation, so to speak, from the sources, whatever there is, and putting them together. That's also a good part of the explanation. There's something else that probably is in his mind, that is everything that makes this place Istanbul, kind of a thing. Everything, but everything that I can find out, that I can lay my hands on, that I can observe. It's not necessarily in written sources only, or that others have observed for me. That is what makes this place. So it is about Istanbul after all, and that is clearly not lost on him at any moment. It is about what makes Istanbul.
And that can be documented or has been documented. If now I'm thinking, if we think of different entries, for example, Hagia Sophia, it's, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 pages. It's been so documented. So everything, is brought, this documentation is synthesized, not synthesized really, but brought into the pages. Nothing is lost. But then there are these tiny little entries where there's absolutely nothing. But then there is the visits and these, rector and the notes that are taken are an amazing, the ultimate level. Like if there is really, really, really absolutely nothing on this thing, when we visit it, we're going to find something to say about it. So it's like this non-stopping, this absolute. There is a sense of tremendous determination to everything matters. Everything matters in this city. Everything meaning also everything, everyone, and so on.
Yeah.
It's also what I was going to tell Ufuk is, the question itself is interesting for why it comes up, because I think it comes up because we have certain expectations about, the logics that we want, encyclopedia or historical writing to be informed by. And so I think this is why we're also finding it very hard to answer. It's like, where is your question coming from, really? Tell us really what you want to say, and then we can communicate. So
no, it's just like I'm just thinking about, how do you classify a city? How do you divide it into certain entries? It's just incomprehensible to my mind. It's curious, how did they go about doing this? So it was not like just trying to understand if there's a logic, or is it just arbitrary? It can be just arbitrary, just like whatever he finds, just doesn't have a method, maybe just like a collector, an antiquarian maybe in a sense, just collects pieces that he finds interesting.
I think it's
there's more
more.
to it.
Yeah. Okay, Cemal, go ahead.
I just want. It really is important about that sense of place that we keep emphasizing. Whatever makes Istanbul the place it is, and not just in the sense of a geography, of course, the place it is that resonates with traditions, with feelings, with meaning, and all sorts of things for the different people. So, for instance, one could consider it arbitrary. I wanted to say a few words about this poetry too, but it is related to this entry. I don't think anybody would have considered that an encyclopedia of a city, which is not common anyway, which is in fact extremely uncommon. But let us say we're doing one, and here he has an entry on ayak, foot, not a person, not a building, not a location. It is ayak, and he, in parentheses, adds İstanbul'da çıplak, yalın, which brings to mind çıplak ayak, yalın ayak, of course. So the next paragraph is interesting. İstanbul'un baharı tadımlıktır. Basically saying spring is very short, fall is a long and enjoyable season. And during summer and fall, İstanbul sokaklarını her gün yüz binlerce ayak yalın, çıplak olarak çiğner. Now, it suddenly is about place, you know. I think if you read his poetry, we don't have time to get into it, he has a particular fascination, I won't mince my words, he has a particular fascination with feet. There are about 20 plus poems, 24 or 25, and almost all of them have a reference to feet. Fine, but I think it's not the explanation as to why he's including it here in the way he's including it. You know, it is about the soil of Istanbul being touched by something that he happens to find very interesting for whatever reason. And then he writes, you know, there are about how many pages on ayak? It is amazing what, you know, you would never imagine. There are different entries with ayak, by the way, including an entry on ayak öpmek. But the entry on ayak is several pages long, and you can see the pictures here with Samiha Bozcalı's assistance, or with Samiha Bozcalı's brilliance, I should say. The article is very well illustrated in the ways he speaks about people touching the soil of Istanbul with bare feet, different sorts of people, different professions, different social classes, not only out of poverty, though many of them happen to be of the lower middle classes or poor. He also has existentialist apache as somebody who would be given to walk with bare feet, or the Amazon kadın. And he has a separate article in another magazine on woman, or a saz şair, as you see on the page on the left, kahvede saz çalan fırın uşağı, etc., etc. So, ayak as an entry would fit into none of the categories we were speaking about before. But somehow he makes it also into a relevant category, which is full of very interesting information and put together from a variety of sources, historical and contemporary for him, that finds itself a place because it is one of the things that makes Istanbul the place it is for him.
Very interesting. It's like a metaphor then, maybe, in a sense.
It does work as a metaphor, but it is also a very concrete thing of feet touching the soil, right?
Mm-hmm. And making the space, maybe.
Yes.
Shall I turn to Gürbey now? Because Gürbey was asking for...
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Gürbey, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk and presentation. I think somehow it's similar to Ufuk's question in some manners, but I would like to ask also again, I would like to ask my question. I wanted to know your opinions about the encyclopedia's form of published media. What do you think about the image and text presentation in the encyclopedia? For instance, we have a textual description of streets, also drawn maps accompanying them. And also, what do you think of its serialization as fascicles? I always find it similar to the illustrated newspapers of the late 19th century before him, tracking both the city's actual and also past events and spaces, and also narrating the city with life and with people like illustrated newspapers were doing before him and also with him. do you think the form of the media and the encyclopedia's dissemination is also unique as its content? Thank you.
Melike, the last question I think is for you more than for us. In other words, I think with your work on the encyclopedia recently and the additional materials that you've been working on, perhaps you would know more about this aspect.
Actually, I must admit, Gürbey is also part of the team, so he's also in the research group that is working on the archive and the encyclopedia. So I think he's more curious about what you are thinking of from his perspective. He already may answer to this, but I think he's curious about what you are thinking of. Maybe,
but maybe I also would like to know, about more about the image and textual montage of the in the encyclopedia. But Cemal Hocam, you are very right, because I'm also in the project, in the archive project. I'm always very interested in how how we see him making of the encyclopedia. We see some collages, we see, different way of, cutting and pasting things, and we see actual documents for that. And that's true, yes.
Maybe at this point, I should also mention that the archive and the digitization project is going towards an end. And at the end of this year, we are hoping that through our collaboration with SALT, the Koçu archive, the archive of the encyclopedia and the details that Gürbey just mentioned, will be available for researchers to work on through digital mediums, like through a website, actually. So maybe then we will have more grounds to discuss the background of the encyclopedia, maybe. Okay, I think I'm checking the YouTube, and I think we don't see further questions. Actually, it has been quite a long time. I would like to thank all our guests that staying with us for a long time online, and particularly tiring for being online. But it was a great pleasure for me, and I hope I'm sure for my colleagues and for the audience. I would like to thank you once again for being with us tonight and sharing your thoughts, your research, your ideas, your reading of Koçu and his Encyclopedia of Istanbul. Would you like to say some final words, or would you like me to just wrap up? Or I just want to ask once more. Would you like to say some final words on Koçu or on what you have just said, or shall I just wrap up? Okay. So
we'll continue.
Okay. Okay. Thank you all once again, and and I would like to say a good night to all of our audience. Thank you once again for being with us tonight.
And thank you.
Thank you
for all the work on the encyclopedia. I want to say before we wrap up, I'm sure my colleagues and all the audience would be very happy to see it coming through.
Yes, looking forward to very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.